Sandra, an 8-year-old German shepherd, adopted 2 Bobcat kittens when they were only 5 weeks old as part of a national program to reintroduce wildcats back into the regions where they had once disappeared. Meanwhile, at the White Lion Wildlife Reserve, a lioness named Sirona gave birth to 3 cubs, but burdened by severe traumas from her past, she lost her maternal instincts and abandoned all of her cubs right after they were born. Tragically, 2 of them did not survive. The remaining one, exhausted from hunger and malnutrition, was barely saved from the brink of death by veterinarians. In a desperate effort to give the tiny creature a chance at life, Sandra was brought in to raise her alongside the 2 orphaned bobcats. A miracle happened. Despite having always disliked cats before, Sandra immediately accepted both species of adopted young. Sensing the urgency in their fragile breaths, she not only nursed them, but cared for them with her full maternal instinct. But the story did not end there. 2 years later, an event occurred that stunned the entire wildlife research community. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our surprising stories. That morning, the first light of dawn painted the Rocky Mountains of Montana in gold, over the vast lands of the Bitterroot Wildlife Refuge, where Dr. Eleanor Hayes had devoted more than 2 decades of her life to rescuing and caring for orphaned and injured creatures. At 61, with silver streaks running through her auburn hair and hands roughened by years of weather and sun, she believed she had seen every wonder nature could possibly offer. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold over the next 2 years, a story that would shake the very foundations of what we know about the bonds between species and the raw, unyielding power of a mother's love. It began on a bitter March morning when wildlife officers brought in 2 bobcat kittens, barely 5 weeks old, their eyes still wide and uncertain in a world too big for them. Their mother had been struck and killed by a logging truck on Interstate 93, leaving the tiny creatures shivering in a den at the mountain's edge, where they were discovered by passing hikers. The pair, 1 male, 1 female, each weighed less than 2 pounds. Their spotted coats were still soft with baby fur, and the dark tufts at the tips of their ears had only just begun to show a first, fragile promise of the wild blood running through them. In the medical wing of the Bitterroot Rescue Center, Eleanor Hayes carefully examined each bobcat. The male, looking a bit stronger, had a distinctive white patch right on his chest. The female was more slender, with bright amber eyes, so large they seemed oversized for her young face. Both were in severe dehydration and with dangerously low body temperature. As Eleanor patiently fought for their lives, in her mind appeared the image of Ranger, the center's most special assistant. Ranger was an 8-year-old German shepherd, brought to the reserve 6 years earlier after finishing his career as a search and rescue dog. An injury during duty had left his hind leg permanently limping, and so his handler, David Miller, brought Ranger here, knowing that Eleanor was well known for giving retired dogs a new purpose in life. Ranger quickly proved himself an indispensable helper. His strong maternal instincts helped him care for all kinds of orphans, from young deer to little raccoons. Just a few months earlier, Ranger had weaned his own litter of puppies, who were later adopted into families all over western Montana. "What do you think, old girl?" Eleanor asked softly, her eyes glancing at Ranger, the dog lying in her bed in the corner of the medical room, watching intently every movement of the 2 young bobcats. Her ears stood erect, her intelligent brown eyes shining, never leaving the tiny creatures trembling in the warming box. This was part of the reserve's reintroduction program, using domestic dogs to pass on essential survival skills to orphaned bobcats, while also giving them the maternal care they so desperately needed. An approach far from conventional, but Eleanor had seen it work before with smaller wildcats. Ranger slowly stepped forward, each step careful on the wooden floor, her nose twitching constantly, breathing in the strange new scents to memorize and analyze. And then the miracle happened immediate, so clear that it made Eleanor hold her breath. Although in the past she had always shown annoyance toward any house cat around the reserve, Ranger's demeanor suddenly softened. She lowered herself, lying down right next to the warming box, and let out soft whines, the very sound Eleanor had once heard her make, only for her own litter. Within just a few hours, Ranger had completely accepted the two young bobcats. She carefully licked every corner of their tiny bodies, her large tongue moving slowly, so gently it seemed as if she feared hurting them. When Eleanor prepared the formula, Ranger watched every movement, occasionally nudging her arm with her nose, as if to remind her when she felt the bottle wasn't held at the right angle. At night, Ranger curled her body around the small creatures, sharing her warmth to drive away the cold, her steady heartbeat, becoming a miraculous substitute for the embrace of the mother they had lost. And then, the kittens began to grow, day by day. After only 2 weeks, they were climbing all over Ranger's patient body, pouncing on her tail as if it were prey, and engaging in fierce wrestling matches, play that would one day hone the instincts to make them true hunters. Ranger endured it all with extraordinary tolerance, only sometimes placing her paw gently to discipline them when their needle-sharp claws scratched too deep. It was during these seemingly peaceful moments that everything changed. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. On the other end of the line was Robert Bob Harrison, calling from the Harrison Exotic Wildlife Sanctuary, located about 40 miles south of Bitterroot. And he had urgent news. Bob's facility, though smaller than the state reserve, was known for taking in exotic animals, rescued from illegal owners or failed roadside zoos. His voice over the phone was hurried and tense. "Eleanor, I need your help. We're facing a situation here I've never dealt with in my life." The words made Eleanor's heart tighten. A lioness named Nala had been rescued from an illegal breeding facility in Nevada 2 years earlier. After years of forced breeding and abuse, she carried deep trauma, but had gradually recovered somewhat at Bob's sanctuary. Yet, against all expectations, Nala had given birth to 3 cubs, likely conceived just before she was rescued. But her maternal instincts had been destroyed by her traumatic past. From the moment they opened their eyes to the world, Nala coldly rejected all of her cubs. The first 2 had not survived. Bob's voice was heavy, filled with grief. But the third one, she's still holding on, barely 2 weeks old, severely malnourished. The veterinarian says she needs constant care, the kind of mothering that Nala cannot provide. "Eleanor, I remember you once told me about Ranger and those bobcats. What do you think?" Eleanor glanced over at Ranger, who at that moment was patiently grooming the bobcat pair, the little creatures who had grown noticeably in just 3 weeks of care at the center. A lion cub. Unprecedented. Possibly dangerous. Certainly controversial. But the only other choice was to let her die quietly. "Bring her here," Eleanor replied, without hesitation. That evening, the lion cub was brought in, and Eleanor's heart nearly broke when she saw her. She was impossibly small, her ribs showing clearly through her thin, tawny coat, her eyes only just opening, cloudy and weak. The veterinarian who came with Bob estimated she weighed less than 3 pounds, a dangerous weight for a 2-week-old lion cub. She was gasping for breath, her chest rising and falling with difficulty, her body so weak it hardly responded to any stimulation. Eleanor prepared a special area in the medical room, separate but still close enough for Ranger to observe from where he was tending the bobcat pair. She needed to know Ranger's reaction before attempting any contact. The German Shepherd watched intently, while Eleanor and the veterinarian struggled to keep the lion cub alive, administering fluids, then patiently trying to feed her with a specialized bottle. But the tiny, fragile lion cub turned her head away in refusal, her breathing growing weaker and weaker. Eleanor tried everything, changing positions, adjusting the temperature, even trying different types of bottle nipples. Nothing worked. Each breath from the cub sounded like a countdown. The room grew heavy in desperate silence. It was Ranger who broke the silence. She stood up, leaving the bobcats after hours at their side, and walked steadily toward Eleanor. Ranger nudged Eleanor's arm gently, then lowered her head toward the tiny dying creature. Her body language was unmistakable. She wanted to help. "Ranger still has milk," Eleanor whispered to Bob and the veterinarian. "She weaned her puppies not long ago, and she still produces a little for the bobcats, though they are mostly on formula now." It was a gamble. A lion cub and a domestic dog, two species separated by millions of years of evolution. But when Eleanor gently placed the fragile lion cub next to Ranger, a miracle happened. Ranger immediately bent down to lick the tiny creature, her gestures even more urgent than when she cared for the bobcats. She shifted her body carefully, and within moments, the lion cub had found her teeth, suckling slowly, weakly, but steadily, as if clinging to the last thread of life. The room fell silent, except for the tiny sounds that came with each trembling suckle. Bob Harrison, the man who had devoted 3 decades to exotic animals, felt hot tears roll down his weathered face. The veterinarian sitting nearby quietly took notes, aware that they were witnessing a moment beyond any textbook, a living testament to maternal love across species. In the weeks that followed, Ranger's routine became a delicate dance of maternal instinct, nursing, carefully licking clean, and protecting all 3 creatures of different species, an unusual brood, yet bound to her as if by blood. Ranger showed no favoritism, despite the enormous differences between them. The 2 bobcats, now 7 weeks old, accepted their strange sibling with natural innocence. They curled up together, a tangle of spotted fur, mixed with tiny lion paws, while Ranger quietly kept watch. Eleanor recorded every detail meticulously. The lion cub, named Hope by the staff, began to gain weight rapidly. Her eyes grew brighter each day, and after only 2 weeks, she was already trying to join the play with her 2 bobcat siblings. Though clumsy in body and slow in movement, Hope stubbornly kept following along, seemingly unaware that she was different. Ranger, as if with a supernatural instinct, understood the needs of each adopted child. During play, she was gentler and more patient with Hope. But at feeding time, Ranger became strict, making sure the 2 smaller bobcats still got their fair share, even as Hope grew noticeably larger. As spring gave way to summer, Ranger began taking her unusual brood on supervised walks through the enclosed forest of the reserve. This was a crucial stage of development for the bobcats. They needed to feel the breath of nature, to touch the wild environment that would one day become their true home. Hope toddled closely behind, trying to imitate the stalking posture of the 2 bobcats, while Ranger stayed vigilant, her brown eyes following every smallest movement. Those walks quickly became legendary in the reserve. Volunteers often stood at a distance, keeping a respectful space, yet unable to hide their amazement as they witnessed a German shepherd leading her mixed family through the thick underbrush. Ranger taught them all the same lessons: how to observe their surroundings, how to move quietly beneath the forest canopy, how to investigate scents and listen to strange sounds while staying safe. The image of Ranger gently placing her paw to correct Hope's stalking posture became Eleanor's favorite photograph, later published in a feature by National Geographic about the miraculous stories of maternal love across species. But as summer came to a close, reality began to creep into that beautiful picture. The 2 bobcats, now 4 months old, were becoming increasingly independent. Their hunting instincts were surging strongly, and they needed to enter the transitional stage to return to true life in the wild. Meanwhile, Hope, only 3 months old, was already nearly Ranger's size and continued to grow at an astonishing rate. Safety concerns could no longer be ignored. The decision to separate them was a heartbreaking one. Eleanor knew it was necessary. The two bobcats had to hone their wild instincts without being influenced by upbringing in a domestic environment. As for Hope, she needed to begin her journey of socializing with her own kind at Bob's sanctuary, where a recently rescued lioness was also raising cubs close to her age. The separation took place gradually over the first 2 weeks of September. The bobcat pair was moved to a large semi-wild enclosure deep within the reserve's forest, where all contact with humans was minimized. Hope was taken back to Bob's sanctuary, joining the pride of lions in a specially designed area to ensure safety. Ranger was present for every step of that transition, and somehow, in a miraculous way, she seemed to understand that this was something unavoidable. On the first night, after all three had left, Ranger refused to eat. She only lay still in the familiar spot, the place where she had once held and nursed them, occasionally letting out soft, stifled whines. Eleanor sat beside her, gently stroking her graying muzzle. Both human and dog shared a quiet grief, the closing of a miracle that would never be repeated. For many weeks, Ranger continued to quietly patrol the paths where she had once walked with her special mixed family, trying to find the familiar scents that now only lingered faintly, fading more with each passing day. That winter came early and harsh, yet the bobcat pair, now released into a remote part of the reserve, continued to thrive, monitored through the surveillance cameras. They hunted successfully, established territory, and showed every sign of a promising reintegration. As for Hope, Eleanor received regular updates from Bob. She had integrated wonderfully with the new pride of lions and was growing into a magnificent and regal lioness. Ranger returned to her usual work at the reserve, helping to raise other orphaned animals. But something in her had changed forever. Ranger became quieter, her gaze more thoughtful. Often, she would sit motionless for long periods, staring off toward the forest, the place where she had last walked with her special family. 2 years passed. It was another March morning, almost exactly 2 years since the first bobcat pair had been brought in, when Eleanor heard Ranger barking. Not her usual warning bark, but a sound entirely different, lively, almost joyful. She hurried outside and saw Ranger standing by the fence that separated the reserve from the wild forest. On the other side of the fence, a fully grown bobcat sat still, the distinctive white patch still visible on his chest. The kitten from years ago had now become a magnificent adult, weighing nearly 30 pounds, sitting calmly, his golden eyes locked firmly on Ranger's. The two gazed at each other silently for a long time. And then, the bobcat did something extraordinary. He let out a chirp, the trilling sound bobcats usually use to call their young, but this time, it was directed at a dog. Ranger's tail wagged so hard, her entire body shook. She lowered herself into a play bow, just as she had done when he was a kitten. In response, the bobcat rubbed his body against the fence, right where Ranger was pressing her nose through. They stayed that way, motionless but full of meaning, for a few short minutes. Then the bobcat quietly returned to the forest. But before disappearing, he looked back, as if this time it was a final farewell, a sacred goodbye. News of the reunion spread quickly, and the next morning Bob Harrison called. "You need to come right away, Eleanor." His voice broke. Eleanor and Ranger got in the car and drove toward Bob's sanctuary. When they approached the enclosure where Hope, now a fully grown lioness, weighing nearly 280 pounds, all muscle and radiant majesty was kept, She immediately rushed to the fence. The sound that came from Hope's throat was not a fierce roar, but a series of soft chuffs, the unique greeting that lions reserve only for their family. Ranger, showing no fear, pressed up against the fence. Her tail wagged non-stop, her throat releasing soft, trembling whines. Hope lowered herself, pressing her massive body against the fence, trying to get as close to Ranger as possible. Then, with a gesture that made everyone freeze, she began to lick her own paw, a simple behavior, but one that was the very lesson Ranger had once taught her when she was still a frail, milk-hungry cub. They stayed together like that for nearly an hour, a lioness and a German shepherd, separated by cold steel, yet bound by a tie stronger than any boundary. When it came time to leave, Hope slowly walked along the fence, her steps trailing close to Ranger's vehicle until its shape disappeared around the bend. That reunion quickly became national news. Wildlife biologists came to study, trying to understand how such a bond could have endured after 2 years apart and a species divide that seemed impossible to bridge. But Eleanor knew the answer was simpler than any scientific theory. Love rises above biology. Ranger lived another 4 years, continuing her work at the reserve, caring for orphaned creatures until the very end of her life. And in the faint, grainy footage from surveillance cameras, a pair of adult bobcats was still occasionally seen, appearing on the trails where Ranger had once led them on walks. Hope grew into one of the gentlest residents of the sanctuary. She was often chosen to help newly rescued animals adjust to their environment because her unusual upbringing had given her a rare capacity for empathy in the wild world. When Ranger passed away in her sleep at the age of 14, Eleanor shared the sad news with both Bob's sanctuary and the reserve staff. That night, the cameras in the bobcat territory captured a miraculous scene. Both bobcats, now with their own territories and families, appeared together by the fence, the very place where the male had once come to find Ranger. They sat motionless under the moonlight, lifting their faces to let out wild cries that echoed into the night, as if offering a farewell song to their cross-species foster mother. At the same time, at Bob's sanctuary, Hope paced back and forth all night, letting out mournful cries, as if she understood that the dog who had once saved her life, the mother in every sacred sense of the word, was now gone. Eleanor had Ranger cremated. With special permission, she scattered part of her ashes in the forest, where she had once walked with her unusual brood, and sent the rest to Bob to scatter in Hope's enclosure, where an invisible but eternal bond would forever connect the three species. As she watched Ranger's ashes drift away in the wind, Eleanor thought of the countless lives Ranger had touched, but none more deeply than 3 small, wild creatures, beings who had once desperately needed a mother and had found maternal love in the most unexpected place. The reserve later built a memorial garden for Ranger, with a bronze statue depicting her beside the 2 bobcat kittens and the frail lion cub from long ago. On the bronze plaque was inscribed the words, "Love knows no boundaries, no species, no limits," in memory of Ranger, who taught us that a mother's heart is big enough for all living creatures on Earth. Visitors often ask Eleanor if the story is true, whether a dog really could raise wild animals of another species, and whether they truly remembered her after so many years apart. She only smiles and points toward the forest. There, if you are lucky and very quiet, you might catch sight of a bobcat with a white patch on his chest, sitting silently near the memorial garden, guarding the memory of the dog who once raised him with a love that crossed every boundary. Love, Eleanor often says, is the greatest force in nature. It builds bridges across every divide, heals the deepest wounds, and creates families in ways no one could ever expect. Ranger proved that every single day of her life And her legacy continues to live on in every creature she ever touched. And at the sanctuary, 40 miles to the south, a magnificent lioness still gives soft chuffs whenever she sees a German Shepherd, as if remembering the one who gave her life when her own mother could not. The one who taught her that family is not defined by species, but by fierce, protective, boundless love, a love that knows no boundaries.